In this section of the course, we're going to be setting up a project that we can use to create our code. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we're going to do in this section. In this section, I'm going to introduce you to using Docker for development. We're going to be creating a new Django project using Docker, and then we're going to be using Docker and Django together to create a development server. I'll show you how to create and set up a new Django project, and we'll add testing and linting to that project, and we'll be using Docker Compose to configure our development server. So why use Docker for development? Well, there are many benefits to using Docker for development. One of them is that you have a consistent development and production environment. So with Docker, you can use the same image for your development as you use for production. This means that you're using exactly the same code on production, and it eliminates all of those issues where you might have a problem that occurs on the production server, but you can't reproduce it locally. Because you're using the same image and the same set of base dependencies, you should have a consistent environment on your local development machine and on the server you deploy the application to. Another benefit is easier collaboration. Often you'll be working on projects with other developers, and there are so many times that I can think of where I've been sharing a project with a developer, and what happens is it works perfectly fine on my machine and everything works normally. However, when we go to run the project on the other developer's machine, they run into a whole world of issues. And this often happens because the dependencies that are on my machine, so dependencies are any software that our project depends on, are different from the dependencies on the other developer's machine. For example, they might have a different version of Python, or they might have a different version of the database we're using, or a different version of some SDK tool that we're using on the software. And this means that you have a whole load of issues to sort out because you basically need to make sure all the dependencies are exactly the same on both machines. However, when you use Docker, this eliminates all of those problems because all your dependencies are inside the Docker image, which is defined in your project. So when the other developer runs your project that is set up to use Docker, in almost all cases, it just works. They just run the Docker images and it just works fine. Another benefit is that using Docker allows you to capture all of the dependencies in the source code of your project. You don't need to install things manually on your machine and configure them to work with your project. It can all be done in the code. You can define every single dependency that your project needs inside the source code. This again helps with the easier collaboration. For example, you can have all of the requirements, your Python requirements, defined in your project, and you can also add all of the operating system level dependencies in your Docker file. And I'm going to be showing you how you do this as we move through the course. Another benefit is easier cleanup. So if you're working as a professional developer, you'll often be working on various different projects. And you might be just working on a project for a set period of time. So let's say you need to spend a couple of weeks working on a particular project. When you use Docker, when you're finished using that project, you can simply just delete the project files and delete all of the Docker images, and then your system is completely cleared of the dependencies that were needed for that project. You don't need to go through and manually remove any SDKs or any databases that might have been on your system. It was all contained inside the Docker configuration for that project. So how are we going to use Docker when we're developing our Django project? First, we'll define a Docker file. The Docker file is going to contain all of the operating system level dependencies that our project needs. Then we'll create a Docker Compose configuration. This will tell Docker how to run the images that are created from our Docker file configuration. We're going to run all the commands that we need for this project through Docker Compose, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. There's one thing to keep in mind when we're using Docker with GitHub Actions. Docker has something called Docker Hub. Docker Hub is where we can pull shared public images down to reuse them for our project. For example, there's an image for Python, like a Python base image for Docker, and that would come from Docker Hub. However, Docker Hub has introduced some rate limits. And a rate limit is basically limiting the amount of access that you have so that you need to upgrade to pay for their paid plan if you want to use more. So it's a way for them to monetize and also to prevent abuse of their platform. So the rate limit that they've introduced is 100 pulls for every 6 hours for unauthenticated users. So an unauthenticated user is just a user that is pulling a Docker image from Docker Hub that hasn't logged in with their Docker Hub credentials. If you do log in, then you get 200 pulls for every 6 hours. So it doubles the limit, and this should be more than enough to follow this course. So you shouldn't need to upgrade to a different plan. You should be able to manage with just 200 pulls for every 6 hours. In fact, both of these rate limits would normally be fine for a project like this. However, the problem is that we're going to be running Docker on GitHub Actions, which is a shared service. So we're not going to be the only developers in the world using GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions works by running our code on shared servers, which are used by many other projects and many other developers. So this means that this 100 pulls for every 6 hours is applied for every single person using the servers that are shared between all of the different developers on GitHub Actions. This is a problem because this means that this 100 pulls every 6 hours gets quickly used up. So the way that we're going to get around this problem is we're going to authenticate with Docker Hub. So to authenticate with Docker Hub, we'll start by creating a Docker Hub account. Then we're going to set up credentials that are used by our project in order to log in before we run a job that pulls Docker images. This means we can take advantage of the 200 pulls for every 6 hours, which should be more than enough to follow this course. So that's an overview of what we're going to be doing for our project setup.